What are the most effective 1-2 punch strategies for singles and doubles, and how do you set them up with points earlier in the match? So interesting way of phrasing that, Jordan. We're going to come back to that. So I got 3 steps for you here, and excellent question. You should be thinking not just in terms of like strength or weakness, but in terms of pattern. How can I set things up to give me the advantage and hopefully, ideally, take the advantage away from my opponent at the very same time? So step 1 is to be a really good Sherlock Holmes, to be a good observer and use deductive reasoning and just ask, like, what is it about what's happening on the other side of the net that looks a little rough around the edges, or like it might be a little bit difficult to repeat again and again. So what we're looking for is the 2 or 3 biggest flaws or weaknesses. So specific things to look for. Look for movement. How smooth or how efficient does it look? Or how rough and kind of jerky and janky does it look? Shout out to Kevin Garlington for the word janky. Look for balance and positioning. A lot of times players put themselves in the wrong spot on the court, and or when trying to recover. This obviously ties in closely with movement. They just don't do it very gracefully or efficiently, and so they'll leave gaps of exposed court available for you. Look for technical fluidity, like how smoothly do they move their body on their forehand side versus their backhand side, on their drive or their topspin shot versus their slice shot. And so you should be just eventually, intuitively, kind of going down through this checklist in your mind. These are just some examples. If all of us collectively kind of made a master list of things to look for, I mean, we could easily come up with 100, 200, 300 things to look for that are potential red flags. I'm just trying to give you some food for thought here. And then finally, look for shot consistency. Like, what is the result and how repeatable is that result? There's going to be a shot, no matter who you're playing, even if they're like way better than you, there's going to be a shot that is a little bit more volatile, and there's probably going to be a shot or two where it's like, it's just the same. It's the same tempo, the same speed, the same height, the same depth, the same spin, like again and again and again and again. Okay, like make note of that, but on the other end of the spectrum, rather than just be impressed and be like, holy crap, like their backhand slice is just a wall, like they just never miss it. Well, what is it about their strokes that is, again, is a little rough around the edges and is more volatile, where even if they're trying to hit you the ball, there's like a range of where the ball goes. Some are a little higher, some are a little lower, some are a little wider, some are a little deeper, some are a little bit shorter. You should be making mental notes of these things during the warm-up, and definitely during the first 2, 3, like 4 games is a critical period for you to make, like, red flags should be going up, lights should be blinking, like whatever, bells should be going off in your head when you start seeing the volatility, the jerkiness, the rough around the edges, the lack of smoothness. These are the things that you should be looking for, and that this is how we're going to start to create these patterns. So step 2 is to create 2 or 3 simple, deadly patterns. And emphasis here is on simple. Good tennis is not about complexity. Good tennis is not about setting up a chain reaction of like 5 different shots in a row, where first I'm going to push them deep, and then I'm going to get them short, and then I'm going to hit heavy topspin, and then slice, and then after that, then I'm going to drop shot, and then I'm going to lob, and that's going to open the court, and then I'm going to hit the winner. Like, no, that's ridiculous. Even elite, high-level players, they're only thinking in batches of like groupings of like 2 shots, maybe 3, but that's pretty extreme. A lot of times we only need 1. We only need a single shot. It doesn't even have to be a pattern. Shout out to Will Hamilton at fuzzyyellowballs.com. He's the first person I heard use the phrase battering ram, meaning, let's go to the court, meaning if you see early on that your opponent's forehand is super solid, and that's the shot where it's like, man, it's just the same. It's just a carbon copy again and again and again. But if you change direction because you're like, man, I'm never going to win this way going to the forehand, let's try the backhand. And on the backhand side, it's like, it's a little bit rough. Like, it doesn't even have to be where like you hit them a backhand and they just immediately chunk it into the net. But it's like kind of high and loopy. And then the next one, they kind of drive it barely over the net. And then they kind of hit one wide, and then they hit a couple okay ones, and then they hit one deep. That's the first shot that you should be targeting. And the battering ram simply means let's focus all of our attention and all of our intention on hitting everything we can within reason over to that side of the court. This is like the most simple, basic way that we can be mindful of our opponents and then set up a pattern of play. And in this case, the simplest pattern ever, just target this side and just repeat it again and again and again. And this works for doubles too, by the way. In a doubles scenario, same kind of deal. If somebody's backhand is obviously the weaker one, let's go ahead and set up doubles. And so it might mean that right off the bat, you're saying to yourself, well, their backhand is weak, it's unreliable, so I'm going to hit a kick serve out to the backhand, and then if they get it back, we're just going to keep the pressure on until we get such a weak shot that we can put it away someplace else, through the middle or at the feet of the net player or something like that. So keep it simple is really the first most important rule here. And the battering ram approach is the simplest way. I mean, this is what Nadal does, right? He takes his forehand, hits it to his opponent's backhand, and then just repeats again and again and again until there's exposed court somewhere else, and then he goes somewhere else. Very, very simple. And it just needs to be repeatable in order for it to be effective. So the second way of thinking about this, setting up these patterns, is to stretch and then expose. So let's start with the doubles example first. So let's say that this is a left-handed player over on the other side of the net, and they love their forehand. So they're setting up like over here to try to hit as many forehands as possible, and they're doing that because they're trying to hide the backhand. Well, rather than target here, which is usually tends to be everybody's first thought, is, oh, okay, well, I see what you're doing there. You don't like your backhand, so I'm going to try to make you hit backhands. And so you keep targeting that tee again and again and again. And every time you target the tee, the lefty moves over a little more and a little more and a little more, and he just keeps hitting more and more and more forehands. This is where we need a 1-2 punch. And this is where you can stretch them and then expose what they don't want to hit. So rather than just being totally myopic and just thinking, oh, I can only focus on the backhand, let's actually on purpose hit it as far over to the shot they want. Because if we do that, that will stretch them in the opposite direction, and that exposes the next target, which hopefully is going to be their weakness. The chances, if we pull them all the way off in this position, the chances of them hitting another forehand on the next shot are really, really low. Even if we struggle with the next ball, they're likely going to have to hit a backhand on the next shot. And so it's the same thing in singles. You see professional players do this a lot, and especially, I would say, like the last couple years, a pattern that's been really popular because most players are righty is they'll target on the deuce side, hit a really big swinging slice serve, because as a right-handed player, the slice curves off to the left. And so even though the forehand tends to be the favorite shot of the opponent, what professional players are doing a ton is targeting the out wide corner, getting a little bit of stretch on their opponent on the return of serve, and then whatever comes back next, they're thinking in terms of 1-2 punch and targeting the backhand side next. And so, yes, we're hitting a ball to their strength first, but it's consciously to set up what's going to come second. It's to set up the second shot. And so this is just one specific, example. It might not always work out for you, depending on your opponent. This is where Sherlock Holmes comes into play. You have to be paying close attention and taking specific notes on each specific opponent. They're not always going to be right-handed. They're not always going to prefer their forehand. It's not always going to be singles or doubles. And so you have to be intelligent enough as a competitor to notice the correct things up front and then start to set up these patterns. So this is just a very simple, straightforward, probably recognizable pattern that you've seen just recently, watching tennis on TV. And that's an example of the stretch and expose. So the core tactic there is hit it to the shot they want, hopefully at least in a little bit of a challenging way, to expose the shot they don't want. And you can do that in both singles and doubles. And here's the third key here. This is maybe the most important one. Going back to what I said a moment ago, this is not about being complicated. This is not about being sneaky. This is not about being tricky. This is about finding a pattern or two that does work and then just going to the well until it's dry. Meaning, as long as there's water there, as long as you're still milking some points from that target or that pattern, you just hammer it. Just again and again and again and again until one of two things happens. Either they make a tactical adjustment in where they're standing or where they're aiming, or they make an adjustment tactically that neutralizes your plan, or they make a technical adjustment. So if at the beginning of the match their backhand is just a train wreck and they're hitting the net again and again and again, every time you get the ball a little bit high to their backhand, they just dump it right into the net. Well, it might be that at 5-0 in the first set, they all of a sudden kind of figure it out. And they're like, oh, that's right. Like, I got to swing low to high. And then they start missing the net. And all of a sudden, they kind of get into a groove. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, man, like they're actually looking really good now on their backhand side. Then you shift. Then you shift the focus over to the second most vulnerable pattern or shot or whatever it is. Remember all the different things we talked about earlier. Go to the second most vulnerable thing that you picked out and then go to that one and just milk that one and go to the well until that well is dry. It's going to be very rare for us normal players. I'm not talking about professional players who have just loads of talent and tons of tools in their toolbox. For the rest of us kind of normal players, all we need is one of those patterns. Maybe on a tough day, two. If they figure out how to neutralize your first one, maybe you might need two. For most of us, on most days, you're not going to have to go down your checklist to number 7 or 8 or 9. Like, it's not going to go that deep. Like, the person you're playing just doesn't have that many looks. They don't have that many ways of reinventing themselves and figuring out how to problem solve all their different weaknesses. You're going to eventually get them. So it's just a matter of being very focused and very diligent about very simply picking on whatever that rough spot is again and again and again. That's how you're going to be most successful in the game of tennis.